Great to be here. Thanks so much. Well, this morning I was asked to talk about sustaining a movement, and so what I wanted to just open with is sharing 3 nuggets of hope and sustenance that I've kind of picked up along the way, and then to really open things up for a conversation to hear what sustains you, and if you want to talk about any other topic under the sun, we can do that as well. But let me first tell you about my opening nugget for hope and sustenance. So this one for me is called See with Both Eyes. And it's something that I got from a Catholic priest in France. I didn't meet him personally. But he was kind of, at the time, he died around 2007. And before that, he was one of the most beloved people in all of France. He was known for his work with the homeless. His name was Abbé Pierre, if my French pronunciation is correct. And what he once said was this quote, which I often have hanging up in my office: "We must always keep both eyes open, one eye on the world's suffering so that we can fight against it, and the other on its wondrous beauty so that we can give thanks for it." And I've over and over again gone back to that quote, because in dealing with environmental injustices and dealing with climate change, it's so easy to get both eyes on all of the suffering that's going on in the world. And so I'm continually reminding myself, all right, I have to train one of my other eyes, because there is so much beauty. And it's that beauty that sustains me, that motivates me, and it comes in all shapes and forms, right? It could be, my daughters, right, who get me going in the morning, because what I do is so that they have a safe, hospitable world to live in. Or one of the things that I often say is that it's good for sometimes to have a date with nature, right? We live in a world where we often can become disconnected from the natural world around us. And we now know from all these studies about how good it is for us to be out there and to be reconnecting with God's creation, right? And it's an opportunity again to be looking with that eye of gratitude, so that we're not just always consumed with all of these things that rightly deserve our attention and compassion and love. And so those are a couple of the things that I picked up. That first nugget that I wanted to share with you. The second nugget I want to share with you, I'll call go for a runner's high. If any of you are runners or not, now I'm not a runner right now, so I just watch my wife run, and I kind of, what I witnessed the dynamics there is, it's inevitable. Don't think, I'm glad she's not here. She doesn't like me talking about her, But she'll be sitting there saying, "I don't want to go running, I don't want to go running." And then she goes running, she comes back happy and alive. And to me, that relates really to hope in a way, right? That we can't make hope kind of a passive, navel-gazing sport. It's got to be a participatory sport where the hope comes through the acting. And Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish teenager who's kind of sparked this movement, she said something similar, right? She's, don't come asking me for hope. You got to get out there and act. It doesn't, come from doing nothing. And so I think that's an important thing to remember, is that hope comes in the acting and when you get out there. And something that this really came home for me, not just to go out there and get the runner's high by acting, but to find a running partner. I did once train for a marathon, and it wasn't as hard as I thought, because I had a running partner who had run lots of marathons. And the importance of having other people that you're with came to me particularly when I was on a tour of an area of Atlanta that probably it used to be like a railroad line or something, but they turned into the Atlanta green belt. And so now everybody wants to have a condo or an apartment next to this green area that nobody used to want to be around. But today what they've done is they've put art installations all over this green belt and done wonderful things with it. So as I was on the tour, they showed us this giant statue underneath an overpass. And what it was a statue of a real person. Let me see if I can find his name. His name was Tony. And what a church did was that they gathered people from the surrounding community and they went out one weekend and they picked up all of the garbage that was on the street. And then they took that garbage and gave it to an artist who fashioned it into this giant sculpture of a man named Tony. And Tony was someone who, according to the placard next to the statue, had been broken and homeless and had been loved back into life by a community. And if you go down that path a little ways further, there's a pole, that's another art installation, that has this quote on it. When I is replaced with we, even illness becomes wellness. Right? And so I think it's a good important reminder for us as churches, right, is we come with these pre-made communities, and it's an opportunity for us to make the most of it. We've got running partners, so to speak, to go out there, to take action, and to generate that hope. So the third nugget of hope that I've come across came to me when I had I've had the fantastic opportunity to interview some people from the environmental justice movement during my time. And one thing I should say, in order to appreciate this nugget, well, I'll call this nugget "Step Out on Faith," which comes from a longer quote that I'll read for you in a moment. But in order to appreciate this quote, I tell you a little history. So I always tell audiences that easily one of the top 5 most important events in the history of the United Church occurred in Warren County. Has anybody ever heard of Warren County?
Kentucky. North Carolina?
In North Carolina, that's right. Right. And so here's kind of how the story begins there. So Warren County, rural area, and one day people in that community were realizing that, actually it was actually maybe not in that community, but in rural North Carolina, people were realizing that all of a sudden there's these strange men wearing spacesuits out on the side of the road inspecting things, right? Never seen anything like it, and it really scared people. They're very frightened. They didn't know what it was. Today we call what they were wearing hazmat suits. And so what they were doing was that they were inspecting all of this illegal toxic waste that had been dumped there. A trucking company had been hired to ship PCBs, a carcinogen-laced substance, out of the state of North Carolina to another place, but they decided that to save money, they wouldn't leave North Carolina, they would just dump it on the side of the road. And so it was, we're talking like thousands of gallons of stuff that were along the side of the road. And so all that happened, and so the state of North Carolina had to figure out what they were going to do with all this toxic waste. And, it doesn't take a lot of science to know that probably the last place you want to put it is someplace where the table water, ground level water is high, right? You don't want all that stuff getting into the water. But what do? They put it in one of the places where it was at the highest, Warren County. That was where the state decided. And why did they put it there? Well, it just so happens that was the state with the highest percentage of black population and one of the 2 poorest counties in the entire state. And so they decided that they were going to bring all of this toxic waste to Warren County. The citizens became very concerned. And what was interesting, right, and if you go to North Carolina, rural North Carolina today, it's still like this. My wife's relatives are all from rural North Carolina. Everything is still racially divided. But here you had blacks, whites, Native Americans, middle class, working class, all coming together concerned about this. And first they started meeting in the county courthouse, but then they went to Collie Springs Baptist Church. And one of the early leaders of that was a woman named Dolly Burwell, who is UCC, a member of a UCC church, also on the board for Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And she started being a part of this organizing effort, and she saw that people were getting so riled up that they had all this energy they didn't know what to do with. And so she recruited her pastor, who is a veteran of the Civil Rights Movement and one of the leaders of the UCC's Commission for Racial Justice, to come and train them in nonviolence and nonviolent civil disobedience. So his name was Leon White. And I'll come back to him because that's the person whose quote I want you to hear. So Leon White trained people, and when the time come for the first dump trucks to arrive, about a couple hundred people marched from Collie Springs Baptist Church and put their bodies on the line to prevent the dump trucks from arriving. That first day, a pastor had to go to the hospital because he got hit by a truck. Dolly Burwell was there, Leon White was there, and in that morning, Dolly Burwell was trying to hustle to get her kids off to school and go to get ready for this protest. And her 10-year-old daughter, Kimberly, said that she wasn't going to go to school. She wanted to go with her mom. And so she said, okay. Yeah. And so she takes her. Kimberly, as her mother is getting loaded onto the paddy wagon to be arrested that first day, Kimberly is then interviewed. And I always get these people confused. This was Dan Rather or it was one of those prominent news personalities. Interviewed Kimberly, this 10-year-old, as her mother was being arrested. And she was in tears. And what Kimberly would later said, she wasn't crying because her mother was being arrested. She was crying because she was afraid of the PCBs. That same day, Kimberly was also arrested. And she was detained in a local school. That was her jail. Now, the next day, a person by the name of Berndt Chavis would arrive. And Berndt Chavis had spent a number of years, maybe 8 to 10 years, in a North Carolina prison and was ultimately exonerated and set free. He was a UCC minister who was doing community organizing as part of the Civil Rights Movement and was framed for setting a store on fire. And he didn't do it, right? And so not too long ago, he had gotten out of a North Carolina prison. He had no desire to go back to a North Carolina prison. And so he's driving to the local county jail to bail out the people who were arrested on the first day. And he gets stopped by the police, and they arrest him for driving too slow. And he ends up getting locked up. So all this is getting in the national news, and people from around the country are coming. And over the next 6 weeks, over 500 people would be arrested. And a good number of them, like 100 or so, were children and youth. And so that as I try to explain to people today, is kind of like the Standing Rock of 1982, right? You had just people coming from all over the country. It really had pricked the conscience of the nation. And so the UCC, was integral to that. And our offices started to get phone calls from people throughout the country saying that they were experiencing the same thing. There was a toxic waste facility that had been located in their community, and their community happened to be predominantly of color, predominantly poor. And so, as a result, we commissioned what became known as the Toxic Waste and Race Report. It was the first report to ever comprehensively document environmental racism throughout the country. And in fact, Berndt Chavis is the person who coined the term environmental racism. And so he ultimately became the head of the Commission for Racial Justice. He later would go on and become the head of the NAACP and do lots of things. But many things came out of that. One is the drafting of what are called then Principles of Environmental Justice, which were drafted at a People of Color Environmental Summit that we were the lead sponsor for. And because it happened just before a UN gathering, those environmental principles soon were circulated thousands of times in thousands of publications throughout the world. And so all that is kind of created in motion what became known as the environmental justice movement. And it had its origins in Warren County. So Warren County was, in a way, what the Montgomery bus boycott was to the civil rights movement. It was the watershed moment that kickstarted what we still are witnessing the effects of today. So I say all of that to give context then to when I interviewed Leon White. And so I'm going to read you what he told me. He got very passionate, and so I had asked him kind of, you know, for his thoughts on what he wanted to kind of pass along to people today. And this is what he said: "If you have the call, do it. As they say, if you make one step, the Lord will make two or three. You don't get involved because you know what you're doing. You get involved because you have a zeal to try to make the wrong right. That's all. You don't know how you're going to do it. You just challenge the wrong and somehow it works out. You don't have the answer. You seek the answer. You seek for it and you don't know what you're doing. But you have the strength, the power, and the knowledge to do it, but you don't know it, because you never put it into practice before. Our cup runneth over by doing. Our ancestors just did it, and they have a song they would sing, the Lord will make a way somehow. They didn't know the way, but they believed that the way was in them, but they had to step out on it to make it become a reality." And so we have within our own history these rich resources to draw upon as we look for sustenance and hope in our struggles today. And so I wanted to offer those three nuggets for you and to kind of open things up for your own thoughts and reflections on what gives you hope and sustenance.
You just said about make a date with nature. I have a friend who calls that also taking a beauty break, which is pretty important. And sometimes it's as simple as just looking up from the desk if you happen to be near a window and looking outside and finding some little flower through the cement or just something that reminds you that the world is still beautiful.
I appreciate you mentioning Greta. Is it Thunberg?
Yes.
Two words, people who have the right pronunciation.
I don't, but, you know, she's been in the news quite a bit this past week, and every time I heard that she was going to be interviewed somewhere, I made sure to tune in, because I just got such a lift from that young woman and her courage and strength and her laser vision that she's just absolutely moving toward.
I didn't know if I would mention this, but it's a great little book, real short. It's like 68 pages. And I was so moved by it that I decided to author a church-based discussion guide for them. So I'm happy to provide those. But yeah, I mean, she's really good at just like nailing, you know, what needs to be said in real clear terms. And so, yeah, she's powerful. Right?
I just, in relation to what you just suggested, I like that idea because that could be a really great intergenerational book discussion. Here's a 16-year-old, the youth group and the young adults and such, but then to get rest of us in conversation together, because we come from different generations in approaching environmental issues, and it would be really interesting then to learn from each other.
We did something a year ago, an effort where we're encouraging youth to preach on climate change. And immediately I was emailed by is the guy who at one time was the pastor of our First Creation Justice Church. Like, he's been doing this stuff for years, has written a book on it. And so he's no stranger to environmental worship services. And he said out of all his years of doing this, that was the most powerful worship experience he had ever had on the environment, was to hear a youth preach a sermon on climate change.
Well, I just think it's important. I have a commitment. I have to go out and give presentations on climate change because I went through Al Gore's 3-day training session.
Oh, great.
And our commitment is to go out and do these presentations. So I've been giving this a lot of thought. And one of the things I think is important is not to spend a lot of time on the doom and gloom, but on the hope and the things that we can do to fight climate change and to make a difference.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on that. Yeah, I remember when I first moved to Cleveland to be the Minister for Environmental Justice, I was really gung-ho, and I was driving with my wife around on the highway. I was telling her about, essentially, in a nutshell, that the world was going to hell in a handbasket if we didn't do something. And she told me in no uncertain terms that what I was saying was not inspiring her at all. so I learned, she taught me early on that that's probably not the approach and tack to take. And so I think you're right that we do need to, tell the truth, but to also bring it with some hope.
Well, in that vein, I attended the Earth Care Presby Congregation Church, local church meeting. It was very inspiring because they're all saying what Greta was saying, the earth is on fire, we've got to act. I mean, they were quoting her too, and that we're past time for education. We don't need to be telling people about how awful climate change is. We need to do stuff. And then what the local churches are doing was really inspiring, whether it's solar panels, community solar, wind source, they're doing things to reduce their carbon footprints. I'm hoping that we can do that too.
Awesome. Great.
We're trying.
Yeah. And in fact, I've got a sign-up sheet over there if you'd like to sign up for it. The name of the newsletter is called The Pollinator. And there's a couple of things I like to always say about the name. The first is that if you kind of have been following, pollinators are under a lot of threat right now. And what is it, 1 out of every 4 or 5 bites of food that we eat depends on pollinators, right? And so the welfare of pollinators is our welfare as well. And so pollinators are threatened because of climate change, pesticides, and habitat loss. And one of the things that I've had the pleasure of interacting with is one of our retired ministers goes around doing workshops with churches on habitat restoration. Because, churches often, I don't know, I haven't looked, but churches often have large plots of land sometimes, and by restoring that to its original native habitat ecosystem characteristics, you bring back pollinators, right? And so all of that is to say that this newsletter is about kind of the cross-fertilization of kind of best practices and inspiration and ideas. And so we're always encouraging churches to write up an article about what they're doing. We had a church in Sonoma that worked with people in their community to create a butterfly highway, right? And there's always creative ideas that are taking place. The kids in my church sold thumbprint cookies to lessen our carbon footprint. They give it all towards carbon offsets, which involved a program in Uganda. And so that there's all these ideas that kind of bubble up from our congregations, and it's through the newsletter, The Pollinator, we encourage people to cross-pollinate and to share what they're doing.
One of the things I came across recently, maybe some of you have seen it, is that grocery stores, instead of just getting rid of things that have passed their due date, they offer them on sale at such and such a time in the evening, and people can come in and buy things 50 to 70% off the regular price. And so they get rid of this produce, or whatever it is, and at the same time, it's not polluting the waste yards.
Right.
I think that's just a terrific idea.
Right. That is, it's
Something
great.
that some grocery stores are trying in France is actually having someone there in the produce department that can steer people to good produce and also keep people from like digging through it and throwing it on the ground so it becomes the spoiled produce.
Right.
And it's just kind of an interesting idea that, at least the story I saw said, they were actually saving money doing that, having a person staffing the area.
Right, right.
At the Earth Care meeting, one of the people, Tommy Evans from Cherokee United Church, was really advocating that we get involved with the climate dividend tax bill in Congress. And I don't, there is a local group, it's a national group of people, and he was telling about going to Washington with 1,200 people went to Washington to lobby the House, their members, for this climate, there's different terminology for it, but it's the dividend tax that would, on fossil fuels that would go back to the taxpayers.
Right.
And he was advocating that our churches explore that, or at least become aware of it. And he was also making a point that there are Republicans in the climate caucus group in the House. And he had a poster that showed like 20 Republican faces with, there are a lot more Democrats, but nonetheless, it is a kind of a coalition. Yeah,
to be in the climate caucus, you actually have to join with someone else from the other party.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. So, and that legislation you're talking about, there was there actually, the United Church of the General Synod resolution in support of that at the last General Synod. Yeah, so that's happened. One thing though I would say is, probably, it's going to be something will come up in different variations every year until something gets passed, right? But I think it's really important to engage the details of this. Right? It's often we don't want to wade into the weeds of this, but there are some things that are worth discussing when you look at these things. One is that if that particular legislation puts a moratorium on the EPA regulating, and so for like 10 years, right? And after 10 years from now, that's the next 10 years is the window of opportunity if you read the UN climate report, right? So that's, what you have to have this conversation, what does that mean if there's going to be a moratorium? And not everybody agrees on what that means, right? And so there are some critical issues to look at with regard to that. Another issue is, okay, it sounds really good if everybody's getting a but is that really the most just thing, right? When we think about the communities that have been most impacted by fossil fuels and will be most impacted by climate change, or are most impacted right now, is the right thing for us to give the equal amount of money to everybody? Those are just questions to be raised and to discuss, right? And I think we'll just continue to see iterations of that bill until something gets passed.
Can you also talk about the United Church divesting from fossil fuels and because they were pretty early on, I think, making a commitment to that.
Yeah, we were the first. Yeah, we were the first denomination to call for divestment from fossil fuels in 2013, and so that's another one of our first. We've had some good first. We were the first denomination, also Christian denomination, to become out in support of the Green New Deal at the last General Synod. The Unitarian Universalists beat us by like one day, so we have to say we're the first Christian denomination. Right.
Well, that was going to work over several years, so how is it going? I mean, it wasn't
the Green New Deal, you mean?
No, the fossil fuel divestment.
Oh, yeah, so that's an interesting issue. I mean, it generated some good energy and momentum at the time that it occurred, and we had some churches come on board at that time in divesting. I think we've realized a couple of things since then. One of them also, I don't know if this is a state in which you can choose what your energy source is. Like, you can't choose who delivers your energy, but often you can choose who the source of the energy. Ohio's like that. And what we've discovered, I think, is analogous to churches, is kind of like a behavioral science thing. The default position of most people is just to leave things as they are, right? And so, you know, most people would prefer to have their energy come from a renewable source, but do they actually sit at a computer and do the 3 clicks required to get a... They usually don't. I mean, it's sad to say, but it's just like the human behavioral aspect of this. And I think it's kind of similar with churches. You know, churches that do have investments, you know, it doesn't take much really to be able to move those investments, especially if you're with United Church funds. But you know, but somebody needs to take the initiative to do it in the local congregation, and so there's more that can be done there. One good development that came out, and actually in relationship to the Standing Rock movement, is I think, yeah, this was a big thing actually here in this area. It was decisions to not just, you know, investments, but where you bank your money, right? Like, you know, not every church has investments, but every church has, you know, some money in the bank. And so why bank with, like at that time the big thing was Wells Fargo, which is investing in, you know, these pipelines, when you can bank with a local credit union or someone else that isn't investing in oil pipelines or, you know, or other fossil fuels in some way. And so that's something that any church can do. And so we had a church in the state of Washington that came up with a guide for helping other churches to move their money out of their banks if their bank was, you know, involved in dirty banking. And so yeah, so that's come up, but we need to keep kind of, it's one of those things you can't keep the fire going, right?
What are a couple of things that you're looking forward to, you know, looking ahead in terms of opportunities, conversations, gatherings, action steps that is kind of fueling you these days?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm really excited is in the UCC we have something called the Council for Climate Justice, and it's about 70 people, and all of the geographic regions in our denomination are a part of it. And clergy, laity, anybody can join. But we always have someone who's the liaison for their conference. And one of the things that after General Assembly passed this resolution on the Green New Deal, we had the executive director for the Sunrise Movement do a webinar with us. And the Sunrise Movement is the primary organization behind the Green New Deal. And so at the end of the webinar, we said, what can churches be doing? And what she said was that they're calling on every institution, not just the government, to do an all-out marshaling of resources, you know, tools, talents, skills to address climate and inequality. And the Green New Deal is calling the government to have a 10-year mobilization to address climate and inequality. And so we thought, well, that would mean, if it applied to our churches, that our churches should be developing 10-year mobilization plans to address climate and inequality. And so we got to work on kind of sketching out what that would mean. And the name that we've given it is, we call it the Kairos 10-year mobilization plan. I don't know if any of you have heard the word Kairos. It's kind of, in some ways, at first can seem like an obscure word, but it's actually the word that has been kind of foremost in liberation theology over the past like 20 years. And what it came out of South Africa during kind of the peak of violence in 1985 there, during an emergency declaration, which meant people were getting, you know, killed you know, by the hundreds. And so in the midst of that, in Soweto, the largest black township in South Africa, laity, clergy, and theologians got together in Soweto and began asking themselves, what is the church doing now when this crisis situation is so horrendous? And they ended up meeting over and over again and came out with something called the Kairos document. And Kairos is the Greek word for time, but it doesn't And Greek is different than our English language because there's two words for time. One has to do with time that you can measure, like the ticking clock kind of time, and the other has to do with the fulfillment of a sense of, now this is the moment in which things are being fulfilled. It's a God-charged moment. It was the moment of Jesus' arrival. That was the Kairos moment. And what they were saying is that right now in South Africa, and this goes, Kairos always takes place in a time of crisis, right? It's a moment of time of crisis and a time of opportunity. And so they said, we are in a Kairos moment. We're in a crisis moment, but we also realize that this is a moment of grace. It's a God-charged moment in which God is issuing a call for us to act. And the result is that it's also a moment of truth for who churches are. How our church is going to respond to this call to act. And so the word is really interesting. Martin Luther King Jr. even used it to describe the beginning of the civil rights movement. Right? What he said was that it was a moment in which history was pregnant with possibility. Right? And so it was a time when a great movement is born. And so what we're saying is that this 10 years that is kind of articulated in reference to the UN climate report as being this critical window of opportunity is our Kairos window of opportunity for churches to mobilize on climate and inequality.